Professor Sundar Sarukkai and our friends. I'm here to introduce Sundar to you. Some of you may not know him, and since I know him for the last so many years, so I got this privilege to introduce him. As the teacher, as the philosopher, as the public intellectual. He at the moment is based at Bangalore, and he is watching what is happening in this country, and he sincerely thinks that freedom is actually in danger. And before, he will speak about it, but anyway there are 2-3 things I must mention about him. One is that he's taking stands against all the establishment. The first stand he took against the scientific establishment, showing that, look here, you just can't thrust in our throat the kind of truth that is so much specialized. That is the talk he gave in the afternoon today in JNU. So he has been fighting against this establishment called scientific community. And you know, scientific community does have a serious problem in terms of really visualizing, imagining what are the normative values of the society. Only technical value is the concern for them. So he is fighting against that kind of one-dimensional understanding of science as technology that will achieve progress. So that is what he is fighting. He is fighting a very big battle. He also is fighting and trying to reason out with the civil society, which has not been very hospitable to our struggle in this country, in this university and universities in other parts of the country. Civil society has not been too hospitable to our struggle, which is so genuine, so based on justice and our own dignified existence. And so that's the biggest struggle. They are not free to think what they are thinking about. So, and he has been having a very hard time with those people who are not really seeing any reason in our struggle. The struggle for freedom is one simple reason one should really side with and stand with. So this is the second fight he's having. The third fight is that he's trying to bring social sciences, humanities and philosophy together. That's a much tougher fight. The people are very recalcitrant to really bridge the gap between the two. The third is more theoretical academic fight. There are people like him in this country who are trying to bridge the gap between the two and give a very comprehensive understanding of what is happening around. These are 3 points I thought I should make about you. Though you have though I and Sundar have one common things to share, that we did a book called Cracked Mirror together, and sorry for this personal detail, but that's not important, don't take it seriously. The point he's making today is about freedom, and he had made this little presentation in Habitat Center about freedom as 2 minutes Maggie noodles. So that's very fascinating. A very simple thing is actually done in a very complex way, but that lecture you're not going to repeat again. So I'm just giving him some agenda. Freedom as a good for the individual is one point, and freedom as a necessity for collectivity is another point. I want to be free and express myself freely so that I can elevate myself to highest levels of imagination and sophistication. That's not the point he's making. I'm just giving you some more point. And the other point is the freedom as necessity, a need for the collectivity. That is the crucial point at this point of time. And I hope we'll listen to him and have, there's no discussion, I don't know. When I spoke, there was no discussion. I was authorial that day. But today you can have some discussion. Thank you very much. Sundar, over to you.
Thank you, Gopal. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Always, wonderful to come back to JNU, and especially on this occasion, I'm really humbled, and I hope, these are very, very small steps, which many of us who are not part of JNU are involved in trying to safeguard the last bastions of quote-unquote freedom. And so I was very delighted when they asked me to speak, and without hesitation I was jumped into it. And to me, the most central question in these, especially in a place like a university, is actually to talk about a freedom which we take so much for granted, and which has also been always seen as the central core of modern universities, the freedom to think. And the freedom to think is often voiced in very simple terms, that we all have a right to think. Who can stop us from thinking? And how does one stop you from thinking? If you look at some of the earliest writings on the origins of universities, any notions of liberal democracies, freedom to think is one of the most important freedoms. But in much of the ways in which they talk about freedom to think, they're talking not about freedom to think whatever you want. That's really not as important a focus as not allowing somebody to tell you what to think. That's the important aspect of the freedom of thinking, which is the foundation of everything that all of you and all of I belong to. This university systems, these academic systems and so on. Which is, I may not have the capacity to think of whatever I want, but nobody can tell me what I can think about and how I can think about it. As a formulation, it seems very simple. It seems something which we can accept so easily. Of course, why should somebody tell me what I should think and how I should think? How can somebody tell me what I should wear and what I shouldn't wear? What language I should learn, what religion to profess and so on? So, in the same way, how can people tell me what to think and how not to think? It's ironical saying this in a university, because as a teacher, that's the only thing I do to my students. I keep telling them what to think, how to think. In fact, I teach a course called Thinking and tell them, no, thinking is the most important thing. So I'll teach you how thinking is, and that's very ironical. And if you look at all this, today's emphasis on education in schools, it's about teaching them critical thinking. Critical thinking suddenly seems to have discovered, a kind of a holy space, right from the government to the private institutions. Teach them thinking, teach them critical thinking. So thinking is like a kind of a skill which they're supposed to imbibe when you go and teach them how to think. And this is the paradox of thinking. Because on the one hand, it becomes the foundational value for a university system, for modern education. It also becomes a foundational value for research. The very idea of research, thinking new things, comes from the possibility of freedom to think. You cannot think of new things. You cannot even think of new ways of understanding the world, of protest, or even of new theories and new theorems, or whatever it is that you want to do, without having this possibility that you can think what has not been thought before. But how is that possible to even understand this point that we can think what has been thought before? We have the freedom to completely think of whatever we want. And the paradox is this, and that's why it's very odd that we can build these great institutions without worrying about the paradox, that thinking most often is not volitional, it's not willful, it just happens. You're just sitting around and you're thinking and just sitting here watching something and listening to something, and a thought pops up in you. And suddenly you think, oh, that is a thought which has come, and I can do something with it, or I may not do something with it. But you haven't really had the original thought through a volitional act. You did not decide to have that thought. In fact, if you really want to know how little control you have after thinking, you just have to watch and try and catch your own thinking. It just pops up and dies out. And the more you resist saying, I will not think about something, it'll keep coming. Thinking is something which seems to be outside your grasp, and yet we are all supposed to have this freedom to think. And not only supposed to have freedom to think is the fundamental value. So I want to actually think a little bit about this freedom to think, particularly in the context of what we all as students are. And why we think all the disciplines that we do, all the modern notions of learning and writing and creating new knowledge are all fundamentally affiliated to thinking. So given this point about thinking, why should we have a privilege about thinking at all? Why should we even take this so seriously that it has become a mantra for education today? We take it seriously. I'll give you two reasons why I think we should take it seriously, or at least why most people would think we should take it seriously. One, thinking is fundamentally associated with the idea of new knowledge. And that's why this possibility that if you want to generate new knowledge, how do you do it? What should you do if I want to learn new things about the world? I can read books and so on, but somebody must have first written those books. What is this origin of new thoughts? So thinking seems to be the most effective, if not the only means by which we can discover things which we have never thought of before. And if human civilization thinks of itself as somebody or something which has to constantly create newer and newer and newer things, this constant craze for variety and multiplicity, then thinking seems to be your way out. It seems to be the most potent weapon for doing it. And secondly, equally importantly, thinking is very closely associated with freedom in a very profound sense. And thinking is associated with freedom for a very simple reason. If you look at the earliest understanding of freedom, something which influences all philosophical traditions, freedom is conceptualized first as a way of escaping constraints. There is no abstract imagination of freedom without it being responding to some very simple conceptual problem, which is what? My body is a burden. My body is a constraint. I can't jump, I can't swim, I can't do certain things, but I want to have the capacity to do it. This capacity of constantly transgressing, going beyond the limits which we live with, is captured in this first fundamental idea of freedom. And that's why, for example, in many philosophical traditions, liberation is a very important philosophical goal. And liberation is what? Liberation is this capacity to transcend the limitations, to be able to go beyond your givenness in the world. You're able to go beyond what you have in the world. And how is that going beyond possible? That going beyond which captures the basic idea of freedom. And what is the easiest way to be free? I can't get rid of my body. I can't suddenly become 7 foot. I can't jump around and run as fast as certain athletes. But I can escape the limitations of my physical world by indulging in this thing called thinking. Thinking becomes a way, a metaphor in a very fundamental sense for freedom. And I will also end with this point that thinking becomes a very important metaphor for desire. And that is the fundamental problem with thinking. But if it is about freedom, then I can just sit here and without going anywhere, I can talk about places where I have not been. I can sit here and think of, one of the most important influence, at least in the Western philosophical tradition, has been this idea, the imagination of, the truth through mathematical entities. And a great debate which influences, in my view, complete history of modern philosophy in the West is this discussion on what constitutes these mathematical things. Why should mathematical things capture this kind of a truth, which the world does not have? And the way they make sense of it is to say, well, mathematical knowledge, which is the best form of knowledge and truth.
I'm the chair, I want to introduce.
Guru is actually my Guruji. He is born with the right name. He didn't have to become a Guru. So he had very when he introduced me, he said he's not going to speak about this, he's not going to speak about that. Those are all the things I was planning to speak on. So now I have to think of other things to speak about. I understand there's a time thing. So yeah. So let me, 15, 20, yeah. So the point I was trying to say is that somehow this capacity for thinking seems to have been associated with the best form of knowledge that one can have. So therefore the question was, what is it then, what is the special capacity of this thing called thinking? So if these are the two very important reasons for thinking, or privileging the idea of thinking, this is the association with the idea of freedom and this association with the possibility of new knowledge, then you have to ask the next question, what does it actually mean to think if you think there is a freedom to think of whatever you want? In fact, let me begin this question with invoking Gopal Guru here again. He wrote a piece about something on egalitarianism in the social sciences, which eventually led to this book he mentioned. And there the point he was posing is this, is that why should or how can people who do not belong to one community talk about another community? In other words, the way we understood this question is, what are the limits to the kind of freedom that you have? If you think you can think about anything in this world, or you can think any way you want in this world, then there has to be certain constraints to it. And that's the question he posed. And there are a lot of people who are, the response is that, first response is to say, how can you stop anybody from thinking about something? How can you stop me from thinking about this tree? Right? Now, if you really look at it historically, this association of thinking with knowledge is actually the central core of freedom of thinking. And I'll just give you one simple example historically of why this is so important. The first point you have to consider, and something which I think all knowledge creation in the world in different societies struggled with. And this is a very simple question. The question is, does the object of knowledge which is created, should it be related to the morality of the person who is creating that knowledge? So the famous example you can ask is that the Nazi Dr. Mengele, who does experiments on his on his prisoners and discovers medical knowledge. And if you ask them why he did it, he would say, I was just curious to see how these Jewish people responded when I pricked them, or when I burnt them, or whatever else he did. What was he trying to do there? He was trying to find ways to find new things about the world, discover new medical knowledge by doing experiments on these people. Now, would we, as citizens of a more sane world, accept the knowledge produced in an immoral manner? Or in other words, does knowledge produced through immoral thinking, does it become valid knowledge for all of us? And that's a very profound problem in the history of knowledge. For a very long time, people would argue that the morality of the knower was fundamentally tied with the value of the known. And if you have that connection, then there is really no freedom to think. So what I will do in this remaining few minutes, just to make this point, just make this connection to you and show you how this capacity for freedom, or what we take for granted today, comes from a very deep historical and institutional process. It's a collective effort at something, and it has a wonderful history. And this is a history of the constitution of modern science. And there the fundamental question which early modern science faces is this. You had constraints on thinking, on what you can think about, how you can think about it. The greatest constraint was from religion. So here you had a kind of an argument that you can't think about everything you want. You have to have constraints towards thinking. And how you create those kinds of knowledge should also be moderated. And the way in which the constraint was posed was this, that curiosity, which we think is a great virtue today, being curious about something, was seen to be something which was a sin. If you go right through the theological accounts from Augustine to Aquinas, curiosity is a sin. For Augustine, it's a fundamental sin, one of the three sins, which is very closely associated with pride. And curiosity was the way you learnt about new things. You are curious about something, you go look at it, try and ask what you want, you explore the world in the ways you want. So if curiosity was a sin, then your search for new knowledge, your search for new things was always moderated by this sin of not thinking certain things. You could not think certain things. And who was going to control your not thinking about certain things? Because remember that the ideas of freedom of expression and freedom of action first comes from freedom of thought. So how would we even know if somebody can stop you from thinking about something? And if you want to understand this modern world we live in, where we think we have the right to think and the right to freedom to think, it begins with a very interesting way, in the way in which curiosity was brought back as a value for thinking. Freedom of thinking becomes synonymous with this wonderful capacity for curiosity. In fact, if you go look at the Nobel Prize website and look at, go click on that, you will see many of these articles on saying how good curiosity is and why children should cultivate curiosity. Einstein says, never lose a holy curiosity. Curiosity is the way you discover new knowledge. And what is curiosity for them? It's a form of free thinking. Curiosity captures the spirit of free thinking. But how would you then answer this question in the early theological tradition that curiosity is evil, is a sin? Because, all examples of this Nosy Parker, Peeping Tom, the fall of Adam and Eve, were all, the narrative around them is about curiosity. You were too curious and you wanted to find something and you burnt your hand or something happened to you. So the question they were actually posing to the problem of free thinking was that you may think, if you have freedom to think, you may do things which may burn you or burn the society or burn the world. That idea that somehow thinking should be constrained and you should not be allowed to think in terms of the knowledge which it may potentially produce was something which is very central to the obstruction of the growth of modern science. And the way in which modern science, this new knowledge begins, is actually very interesting. And the way they do it is first a series of thinkers, scientists, start recapturing and giving positive value for curiosity. So Francis Bacon shifts this problem of curiosity, knowledge associated with curiosity and associated with charity. And therefore, and then there's a whole series of Robert Boyle and so on. All of them, what do? They try and recapture the positive sense of curiosity. And one of the great examples of the time is to say, well, nature is filled with curious objects. So being curious is about natural, and therefore it's very important for us to be curious. To the extent that when the first Royal Society in Britain was formed, the certificate they gave to people, one very famous example, is now you may say he is a very intelligent person or she is a very intelligent person. That person was given a certificate as a member of Royal Society. He was a very curious person. He showed great curiosity. And curiosity was such a virtue that the greatest scientists, including Newton and others, all had to, in Royal Society, had to donate some curiositos, very curious objects to the Royal Society. The point about this curiosity is, and this is the crucial point for me, that the freedom to think what you want is not given easily. It takes these years and of various institutional forms of practices in order to rehabilitate one concept called curiosity and say how the great positive value of curiosity happens, and therefore through that you can finally break the link between the morality of the knower and what is known. We live in a world of that time. We live in a world where your product, your knowledge, your thought is seen as a product, and that's the value, not the person who creates the product. The person who creates a product may get prizes and other things afterwards, but the value of the product, independent of what, I may be a terrible person, but I may have done some very new piece of work, the value is only for that, independent of what kind of a person I am. And if that is the nature of knowledge that we have today, and that's the nature of knowledge which we think we have a freedom to think about. Our freedom to think is based on this model that somehow that you have, all of us have a right to think of whatever we want without any kind of constraints. The earlier problem was, if you look at religion as a form of constraint, which is a very fundamental problem, you don't want somebody in a religious institution telling you what you should think and how you should think. But on the other hand, I think the most challenging question about freedom to think for you is, who is going to regulate you in saying what you will think and how you will think about it? So when Gopal asked this question about why should people who have no stake in something, in a particular community or particular experiences, sit and want to write about it? How do you respond to that question? Why should they be doing that? Is it just because they're curious about it? They just think they can do it. I can do anything I want. Doing a problem. I'm not saying solving, building a big building. Just thinking about a problem. What gives me the right to think I can think about any problem that there is? The right is acquired to you because of this great institutional solidarity which liberates this thinking from all kinds of moral impulses. And so to me, therefore, the central question we have to come back to, and I will end with this, because I think to me, when I think about it, the questions about freedom to think repeatedly comes to this. And these are two very short points. The first one is the fact that thinking is already constrained. We think we are free to think. It's impossible. Thinking is all the time constrained. It's constrained by the language that you have. It's constrained by the concepts that you have. Early logicians called laws of thought, defined logic as laws of human thought. The way you think it's free. It's so constrained that you cannot think in certain ways at all, even if you think you want to think that way. In other words, your meaningful thinking, for example, you may not be able to think, this is one argument, but you can see whether it makes sense to you. If you want to think that I am here and I am not here, and if you're not in a position to think, so if I'm not here, you might think, oh, I am somewhere else. The fact that I am here and I am not here is not a form of thought which will arise to you, and that constraint seems to be a very natural cognitive constraint, the way in which we think. We think, if you accept the argument that thinking is, your thoughts are nothing but words and sentences, then what you think depends on the concepts and language that you have. If your language is better, you may think better, whatever that means. We already constrain our thinking based on our notions of morality. We already constrain our thinking based on our emotional moods and the way we empathize, or whatever kinds of emotional moods which categorize our thinking. We actually don't, it's really very difficult to say I'm going to think completely freely. And in fact, for these modern institutions with these modern knowledge games which they produce, this idea that we are thinking completely freely is a little bit of a problematical idea. So the question about this idea that there is freedom associated with thinking, and the fact that thinking is very utilitarian because you cannot get new knowledge without thinking, have to be, sort of moderated in some sense. And to me, the most important moderation is the point which Gopal also mentioned, and that is a very simple question, and I'll leave you with these couple of questions. And the question, I think, which is important for us to ask in the context of real freedom to think what we want, is to ask the question, is thinking collective or is it individual? Am I completely responsible for my thinking? Or is my thinking in some sense collective with all of you in some sense? People who would argue that thinking has to do with language will have to accept the fact that language is public and shared. It's not mine, unless you have some exotic ideas of private language. I am speaking in a language which all of you are shared and somebody else created. I learnt it with 100 other people and we all speak about it. And if my thinking is influenced by the language that I hold, then my thinking is collective. The emotions I bring into my thinking is collective. It is a product of a particular kind of a social processes. So where then is this idea that thinking, which comes to stand, the freedom to think, which comes to stand, by the way, and why I think it's such an important problem is, it comes to stand for individual autonomy. It stands for the fact that all of us are individual independent beings who can do what we want. And if you understand freedom of thinking as collective, as social, and thinking as already moderated in various ways, then the question about the freedom of thinking, saying that I have a right to think, I have a right to do this and that and so on, reduces to something slightly different. Are all our claims to freedoms of thinking that I have a right to do all this, is it nothing but an imprisonment in desire? That is, the more freedom you think you have to do what you want, it's not really freedom to be what you are or freedom to think, but more immersed you become in this thing called desire. So how then does this tension between freedom, being free in this sense, particularly in the context of thinking, and desire play out? To me, I think this context of freedom of thinking really brings this part out. A lot of people who have great suspicion to people talking about thinking and theory and so on, often contrasted with action and activism and stuff. And very often I keep at least telling them that, look, as Wittgenstein would have it, thinking is a doing, thinking is an activity. And it's a kind of and thinking of this kind is a kind of a very important forms of doing. And we think, therefore, when we look at the question of freedom of thinking in that context, to me, the kind of doing which it involves, the kind of things which it makes you think about, eventually comes back to this shared freedom, any notion of freedom which has to be located in a collective shared solidarity. And I think that, particularly in a context like this, to me, makes far more meaning. Thank you so much.